Thanks for tuning in tonight. My name is Travis Fortney. I'm an adult services librarian at the Willoughby Public Library, and we're coming to you live from Lake County, Ohio, and Buffalo, New York. Tonight, we're going to talk to Brian Castner about his new book, Stampede, about the Klondike Gold Rush that occurred in the Yukon area of Canada from 1896, well, I guess Canada and Alaska, so from 1896 to 1898. Reminder to everyone, you can keep up with future Between the Lines events by looking at the library's Facebook page or keeping track of the events calendar at we247.org. We've got great events coming up with Paul McLean, Jess Walter, and more, so check those out and think about registering. Tonight, I'm extremely happy to welcome Brian Castner to Between the Lines. Brian is the author of Disappointment River, All the Ways We Kill and Die, and the war memoir, The Long Walk, which was adapted into an opera. Former explosive ordnance officer and veteran of the Iraq War, journalism and essays have appeared in the New York Times, Wired, Esquire, and on NPR. Brian will start tonight with a reading from the book. I've got some questions written down for him, but my hope is that those of you watching will participate by asking a lot of questions. Ask something, type your question in the chat on Zoom or comment on Facebook, and I'll ask you a question. Brian, thanks so much for visiting with us tonight.
Yeah, thank you. It's great to be with you again, but to be at the library here. I love libraries ever since I worked in one in college at Marquette University. I was the science library checkout guy, so it's wonderful to be here.
Cool.
We'll get started with the reading, I guess. Is how you wanted to start. Yeah, and I guess you gave just like the short intro there, but Stampede is about the Klondike Gold Rush, which is in the Yukon River, flows from the what's now called the Yukon Territory, at the time the Northwest Territories in Canada, and into Alaska, and it's the story of the people up there. I try to tell the story of the gold rush through the eyes of the people who experienced it. And so we follow a couple main characters, including the people who discovered the gold and went on the Stampede themselves, and Jack London, and people you've heard of and people you haven't. So, and try to do it as much as possible through their stories. So I think the best introduction to a book should be chapter 1, page 1. So I'll start right there, and I'll just read a couple pages about a guy named Robert Henderson, who is one of the main characters in the book. So chapter 1, 1895. In those days, the men who panned for gold in the stream beds of the Yukon Valley would often work with a partner to avert lonesomeness or starvation or worse. But Robert Henderson was his own man, never could find another who matched his endurance for misery. And so when he slipped while crossing an icy creek, there was no one there to right him, and he fell hard, and impaled himself upon the broken shards of a downed pine. Henderson had been working his way across a tree trunk that he had dropped from a makeshift bridge, axe in his right hand, bracing himself against a limb with his left. Below, the stream rushed as a snowmelt cataract. He swung and chopped away the branches that barred his path, but then the limb in his hand snapped and his feet came out from under him in a flash. Henderson tumbled toward the torrent of water. Then sudden blinding pain as the jagged stump of a branch speared the flesh of his calf and wrenched him to a halt midair. There he hung on a hook, like an animal snared in a toothed foot trap, dangling head down over the flooded stream. He was all alone. His axe was still in his hand. With a lurch, Henderson yanked himself up, the bloody stake straining against the tendons in his leg, and he swung hard with his axe. The blade bit and held, and Henderson pulled, and his chest met the trunk, and he clutched it in a bear hug. His leg was somehow free, but he dared not fall, and inch by inch, he pulled himself to the bank. Henderson sat in the muddy slush on the creek edge. A bad wound, he thought. He lowered his mangled leg into the ice-cold water, and it numbed immediately. The creek went pink, then clear, and he pulled out the leg. He knew he could not walk. It was May. The days were long now, the sun warming, and yet snow still lay thick, and the frozen Yukon River had not yet broken. He was stranded, cut off, hungry and lame. No one knew where he was, and even if they did, no one could reach him. 50 hard miles to the nearest settlement, and the rapidly melting rivers were ready to rupture at any moment. He set camp and prepared for a long wait. He carried very little: flour, sugar, salt, a small bit of tea, rifle, pistol, shovel, and pan. His clothes were rags, patches of wool and furs and buckskin, and his hobnailed boots were held together with burlap sacks. His last resupply at the trading post at Ogilvy, the last time he had seen another man, was the year before. Henderson was blue-eyed, tanned, tall and lean like timber. He was nearly 40 years old, no longer a young man, and his face was sunken, overcooked, all the fat drained off. He wore a long mustache that drooped at the corners of his mouth and occasionally got caught in his teeth. Old-timers called him a born prospector. He had the gold fever. He must, to spend the winter cutting trail from the Indian River all the way up Australia Creek, melting snow to wash gravel in the darkness, and for nothing but a few colors, a few specks of gold, 2 cents to the pan. The muscles in the calf were torn, and soon the whole leg swelled and turned bright red, hot to the touch. Henderson's only relief was to crawl on 2 hands and 1 knee to the creek bank and dip the mangled leg in the icy bath. The never-setting sun was fierce off the snows, and Henderson could find no relief from the glare. He pulled his flat-brimmed felt hat down low to his eyes, but it made no difference. His vision went blurry and pained, and he knew snow blindness was coming on, so he rubbed his eyes with salt and water, hoping to stave off the worst of it. Like most prospectors, Henderson shaved in winter, as a beard would solidify into a hazardous mass of ice, but now he grew his whiskers to keep the mosquitoes off. It made little difference. Breeding in the shallows, the insects were ferocious, and Henderson took to wearing a hood of cheesecloth. Even so, the mosquitoes would smother themselves so thickly upon it that he had trouble breathing. Just before he fell crossing the creek, Henderson had shot a caribou and strung up the haunches in a nearby tree. Now he sawed through the 4 quarters and moved that section of raw meat to his tent, to a hole he dug to the permafrost. Then he dug a second hole in the ground, also inside the tent but a little away from the first, and packed the sides with clay. He broke a few twigs into kindling and struck a sulfur match and made a small fire in the hole, and the clay dried and hardened. Every day he cut off a piece of the caribou carcass and made a small fire and put both of them in the little clay oven and cooked the meat, and this was all he ate for the day. The oven smoke clogged the air of the tent, but that was okay. It kept off the mosquitoes. Wolves prowled along the edge of the camp every night. Henderson had no medicines, no poultice to draw out the bilious fluids in his leg, and so he laid strips of bacon across the wound until they were heavy with pus. These have done duty, he thought, as he carefully pulled them off one by one and threw them outside the tent, where the wolves would leap on them, gobble them down, and then back off, temporarily satiated. Henderson tried to count the number of wolves outside his door. Their hideous howling continues both day and night, he rued. Trapped, he imagined hundreds of the animals, their calls echoing in the valley. Other beasts came to the tent flap as well, moose, caribou, and then the very embodiment of his fears. One day he heard grunts and huffs as a broad brown paw pushed through the flap. Henderson recoiled and pulled out his 6-shooter and fired, and blood splattered across the canvas. The bear retreated into the forest, but Henderson lay uneasy, wary, watching. The bear would come back. The only way to kill these Yukon bear was to shoot them through the spine. You could empty 2 pistols into a grizzly's chest, and they'd still fight on with a shredded heart. He'd seen it himself. Henderson listened and waited, vigilant, but the bear never returned. Henderson lay in that tent among the wolves and mosquitoes for 22 days. He starved until his skin hung loose, like ill-fitting clothes. Finally, desperately hungry and thinking his leg at last well enough to take his weight, he packed his gear and pushed on. The sickbed cost him 40 pounds, and he walked with a limp for the rest of his life. That country in the upper Yukon Valley consists of a mix of rounded rolling hills veined with tight stream beds and wide U-shaped valleys dug by glaciers that left silty floors and moraines strewn along the shoulders. Henderson picked his way down among the conifers until he struck the Indian River at its icy spring melt flood. Henderson had no boat, so he shot a moose and skinned it and stretched the hide over a frame of sticks he lashed together, and with this he floated down the Indian. He didn't want to waste a minute of summer light, and he figured his leg was usable enough, so rather than return to Ogilvy for resupply, he instead paddled to a place called Quartz Creek in search of his next prospect. Henderson stashed his boat on the bank and packed his moose meat up the rocky shoulder of the creek bed. Gold followed Quartz, so this could be a lucky spot. He found a place where the waters ran clear and dipped his pan in the gravel and pulled up a mixture of water and rock and dark soil. He shook the pan, and the water splashed over the side and ran down his fingers and forearms. The chunks of gravel scraped and scratched a racket, and he used the tips of his fingers to rake out the largest rocks so he could pick them by hand and toss them aside. Then he took more water in the pan and shook and swirled it so the sand and rock separated. Gold is 20 times heavier than water and 8 times heavier than the sediment with which it mingles, so it is only a matter of patience and skill to slowly clean a pan. And as Henderson shook the pan, he gently tipped it away from himself so the gravel collected on the far side. With every shake, the gold invisibly worked its way down into the deepest crease. He carefully dipped the working edge of the pan in the water, and as he pulled it out, the top layer of lightest sand floated away. He dipped again, and a third time, and once more. Every dip, more bits of gravel slipped off until all that remained were fine black grains. Pay dirt. Henderson poured off most of the water except for a small pool opposite the pay dirt. Then he swirled that slug of water around the bottom crease of the pan like a marble ringing a bowl, and as it circled the well of the pan, it swept off the sand, leaving behind the heavier grains of gold. The flecks emerged like buried treasure in the retreating surf on a beach. A flash, too, but nothing more. Only colors. A disappointment. Undaunted, Henderson hobbled further up the ridge and panned again and again and again and again. Thank you.
Thank you. I always like to start with the reading because I think it's a great way to give people a taste of the book. I'm really glad you read the beginning because that's a great scene there. We already have a comment from the audience. Michael from Eastlake's joining us. He says he's currently reading the Stampede and can't put it down. So I'm really excited to be here and be able to ask you questions. And I said, Michael, please ask anything. I'll ask you a question.
well, thank you, Michael, and thanks for putting the book down long enough to attend. So I appreciate that.
It is, and I'll say I just finished reading the book this afternoon, and it's a very propulsive, very very good book. I think if you like my dad is always asking me for like narrative nonfiction that's a historical, a true story, exciting, and this is it. So I don't know if you dreamed of writing the perfect dad book, but we've really done it.
Well, there's a reason it came out this time of year. I think my publisher dreamed it's the ultimate dad book. So yeah, I mean, and I'm a dad, and writing narrative nonfiction, turning kind of history into a great story, what I hope is a great story, really is what I enjoy doing most. And I mean, to me, the highest compliment is I couldn't put it down, or I wanted to know what happened next. If you constantly want to know what happened next, then to me, I've done my job as a writer. Like that's the kind of books I like to read. And so it's the kind of books I like to write.
Yeah. So I know you're going to cringe at this question, but I like to give people a taste of what the book is about. So what inspired you to write about the Klondike Gold Rush? Do you have a personal connection to Alaska?
Yeah, I find this like, why do you choose the story you do to be an extremely difficult one? And it should be an easy one.
You think, let me ask it this way. Did the last book lead to this one somehow?
Well, right. So the last book, I mean, it did in this way. So the last book, Disappointment River, is about Alexander Mackenzie, who was he was actually the first, the first white man, the first European that had a recorded trip across North America. Like most kids in school learned it was Lewis and Clark, but it wasn't. It was Alexander Mackenzie, and he did it, about 12 years before Lewis and Clark. Um, and he traveled up in Canada, and the Mackenzie River flows up into the Arctic Ocean, and that book is about him, and it's about my travels up there. So clearly I have an affinity for the North. I like the North. I like the Arctic. I like all those stories about going to the North Pole, about going to the South Pole, all the Shackleton stories, the Endurance, Alfred Lansing, like mountaineering books, Krakauer, all these Krakauer wrote obviously about Alaska, Into the Wild. So like I have, these are definitely like interests of mine. That still doesn't quite answer why write this book though. And I have a hard time answering like for the Klondike itself, because except that it's one of those things in American history that I feel like a lot of us know the name or know the word, but you don't actually know the story. Like you don't know what happened. You just know it's this place up there somewhere and there was a gold rush, and that's how Alaska became a state. And that's generally true, but it still doesn't really tell the story of what happened. Another thing I guess that I want to say is, obviously my first couple, you asked about like, does it follow from the last book? My first couple books are about the military. I was a bomb technician in the military. I did a couple tours in Iraq. I wrote a war memoir. Like, how does that fit in, right? And I think the way it fits in is I have a real allergy to glorification and to glorifying hardship and to glorifying death and to glorifying danger. And I have that from the military. I have that from writing about combat. I have a hard time with books that just, that's nothing but flag and glory and everything else. The military experience can be hard and bloody, and that's the kind of books I wrote. And I think the Klondike is the same way, and that if we know anything at all about it, it's prospectors, lucky prospectors and smiling good time girls and friendly Mounties, and like there's
everybody
this very
leaves rich.
Everybody leaves
safe.
Rich.
I don't know.
Yeah, Charlie Chaplin is like falling off a glacier, and isn't it funny? And right. Like if we know anything, it's that, and that is not what happened. What happened is tens of thousands of people died, and in every conceivable way. And so, I wanted to make sure that I once I started to research the story of the Klondike a little bit, and I realized it's essentially a disaster movie. It is shipwrecks and avalanches and freezing to death and scurvy and like every possible way, starvation, every possible way you can possibly lose your life. People did, and they did it mostly anonymously. And in that way, it's much like a war, right? And so I think that attracted me to the story.
Yeah. All right. So the book is like extremely propulsive. It tells like a complete history of the Klondike period is 3 years, 1,000 days.
Right.
And yet the book, something I loved about it is that you have this shifting cast of characters kind of, and it tells this complete history, but from the point of view of, 10 or so characters. I keep calling them characters, historical figures. I'm a fiction guy, so I think in terms of characters. But
well, I do too. I think of them in terms of characters, and in fact, the beginning of the book, I say cast of characters, right? Like I list everybody.
They're all larger than life. They're all. But my question is, how'd you narrow it down to those? How'd you pick those 10?
Yeah. Well, so on one hand, having 10 characters can be a little, I don't know about dangerous, but difficult. You want to make sure the reader can keep track of everybody, right?
Yeah.
Like you don't have just one protagonist. And once I researched the story of the Klondike a bit, I knew that there was no single person that saw it all. If there was a single person that saw it all, I would have told just that person's story, to keep it as tightly focused as I could. But I think the trick is, 10 is about as many as the reader can keep track of. So I didn't want to do 20, right? I wanted to keep it limited. And then really I was trying to find, I had two qualifications. One is I was looking for archetypes. So you have, the prospector who finds it, you have the journalist who writes about it, you have Jack London, who is also like the archetypical stampeder. You have the
Yeah.
Mountie, who's Sam Steele. You have the entrepreneur, Belinda Mulrooney, right? Like you have each of these people that fit a mode, a type of person that was up there. But then I also needed people that where there was just a ton of information. So they had to be people that wrote their own memoirs, did an oral history, wrote a lot of letters, had enough where I could quote them. I could use, the dialogue is out of their own letters or out of their own contemporaneous reports of the time. If I say a character thought something, excuse me, it's because they wrote it in a letter that they thought it at that time, right? Like I needed people with a large body of material that I could mine. And like, I didn't find everybody I wanted to. I really wanted to tell a story, for example, from one of the perspective of one of the sex workers, one of the good time girls, the dancers, the percentage girls, and they just simply didn't leave enough material, and I couldn't do it.
Yeah, that's interesting. So is there anything, I don't know, is there anything that you found that you had to, that you wanted to include, that you found and wanted to include but didn't, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, there are little snippets from some of the sex workers, like some journal entries, but like any ideas that they had in those, I would then cite and give to like other, like just kind of the general, like I would say things like the girls knew this, or the people, like this was widely known, or there was whatever the case was. Like I tried to keep the observation and just generalize it, but keep the citation, obviously. Um, I mean, I also had trouble writing from the perspective of the indigenous people from Skookum Jim, who was part of
Yeah.
the first discovery, and Kate Carmack, who was his sister, who was the wife of George Carmack. We have Kate Carmack was illiterate. We have one letter that she dictated to a lawyer, probably.
Oh, that is the letter you cite in the book, you mean? Yeah.
The one letter I can use, like that's the
Yeah.
only one, right? So, and I managed to work it in. And so I tried to do as much as I could, but there are some people it was really challenging.
So Michael has a question about Jack London, and I have I think a couple questions about Jack London too. So let's take it there.
Let's do it.
I think Jack London is an interesting character to talk about, because if there's, as I was reading this section on Jack London, and this is just like an aside, not a question, but as I was reading this section on Jack London, I thought, boy, I wonder if there's well, I guess it is a question. Is there a book about his, you can really see that as a book or a movie, his like formation as a writer in the Arctic, and up from the bootstraps, Tramp in San Francisco. Does that book exist? I mean,
A little bit. I mean, there's a couple great biographies. There's one called Wolf, I believe, and it's the writer is going to fail me. And then Earl Labor is kind of his well-known academic biographer, and he wrote another biography. I prefer the biography Wolf, but there is also, like in the 1970s, a guy named Walker recreated kind of like every step of Klondike, of London's trip in the Klondike, and then also, and he's an academic as well, tried to cross-reference things that would have happened in London's experience with later short stories or later novels, to say, okay, this thing that happened probably came from here. In John Barleycorn, there's a character named this, but here's the actual person that London met in the Klondike, et cetera, right? So, I mean, when it comes to London, I am standing on the shoulders of giants, where I am just trying to take a massive amount of academic literature and make it one chapter.
Yeah,
essentially.
make it one chapter. Yeah. All right. So Michael's question is, he says he always felt that London's works about, the Klondike were realistic as opposed to romantic. And he wonders if you agree with that characterization.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think what I learned from London is that the work is legit. That I guess when it comes to London, I'm a Seawolf guy. I read Seawolf at a formative teenager age. And I can still recite to you that there's for Wolf Larson, who's the captain of the Seawolf, there's 4 pages about the strength of Wolf Larson's strength, right? It's incredible. I think, stories like his short stories are pretty gruesome. To Build a Fire is probably the most famous, right? And trying to kill a dog and being unable to. And I guess I would agree that it's less romantic and fairly realistic, or at least London, any romance that's in there, I think he earned in a legitimate way. When he did the Klondike trip, he was nobody. He was a tramp. He was broke. He had a series of dead end jobs in pickle factories and, putting twine on bobbins and various things like that. So I think, I don't know, I have more respect for his early work. Later, he kind of gave up the socialism, went full bourgeois, and kind of got into eugenics and a couple other things. So the later London, not nearly as I don't know, salutary, I guess, to put it mildly. But a lot of that early stuff where he made his bones, in the first couple books, I guess I would agree. Certainly less romantic than some of the other stories that came later. Not his, but I just mean Klondike stories that came later.
It's crazy you talk about the later, London's later period when he went off and he died at 40. I mean, it's crazy.
Right. Yeah. I mean, but he was just so prolific and wrote so quickly that there really are multiple stages, right? And he managed to have time to go cover the Russo-Japanese War, and he had time to, do all of these other, I don't know, he packed a lot in. So the biographies, he was 40, whatever, when he died, but they're pretty stout biographies.
Where'd you come across the story of him piloting the boat through the rapids? And then I like that he went back and piloted the older couple's boat through to
Right. I mean, that's Walker's, again, I'm not a London academic, so I'm relying on Walker, who's the academic, who the actual whitewater sections. And I admit, I'm really attracted to the whitewater parts because I'm a whitewater raft guide myself and a whitewater kayaker. And so I'm really drawn to his descriptions of this. But he wrote an essay later that kind of described step by step what it felt like to go through those rapids, the Whitehorse Rapids, etc. And because he did write it in a nonfiction essay later, I then felt comfortable putting the thoughts in his head as he was actually running the rapids. And I think what's interesting is some of the words he uses, like pour overs and combers and the transverse waves and everything else. I mean, that's still how we talk about it in the whitewater world. We use the same terms, that he did 120 something years ago.
Where do you whitewater raft around Buffalo? Just curious. Do you kayak on Lake Erie at all? Or?
I don't. I mean, there is a crew of people here in Buffalo that, when it gets windy, go out and sea kayak the waves on Lake Erie because they get legit out by Hamburg and stuff. But no, Cattaraugus Creek is a Class 3 river in the spring. I do the Genesee Gorge sometimes through Letchworth, and then the Salmon River that comes off Tug Hill, which is the southwestern Adirondacks. And then there's gray water all over the Adirondacks too, but that's now 6 hours away.
Yeah, cool.
I mean, where you are, you should go down to the Yacht and the Cheat and all those around Pittsburgh. So you've trip and you've got plenty.
I don't kayak there, but I go to Ohio Powell quite a bit
There you go.
And a lot of people kayak there.
Do the gollies.
Yeah, I kayak on Lake Erie all the time though, just for exercise. I live right by the lake, and I just go out there and go up and down. It's kind of. All right, back to the book.
Right. I could talk paddling all night, but we won't. So.
So, who's your favorite character in the book?
Yeah, I mean, you're not supposed to have favorites, but my favorite is Anna Degraff, and I wrote her chapter first, actually, because I was
Oh,
so drawn
really?
to her. Yeah. So Anna Degraff, for those who haven't read, is like she's the one where I was able to tell the story of the sex workers like through her eyes. So
Yeah.
she was unusual because she went on the Stampede in her 50s. She had spent time in northern Alaska before. She kind of knew what she was getting into, but she wasn't looking for gold. She was looking for her son who went missing, and she figured must have gone on the Stampede and goes looking for him. And when she gets up to Dawson City, she becomes a seamstress and makes the dresses for the dancers. And so meets all of these women and basically acts as their mother. Everybody called her mother. I think I mean, like I said, I'm a dad. I mean, as a parent, I understand like her motivations. And I think she's just fascinating. And she also is, I mean, she wrote a wonderful out of print memoir that her, let me get this right, great, great, great grandson published, who's an academic in West Virginia, actually. But, you know, so it's I mean, so I had a lot of material to work with, and she's excellent at telling her own story. And then she managed to interact with a number of the key events, you know, key events in the history of Dawson. And not to give it away, but she was there when Dawson burned down. So that was helpful too.
Yeah. Yeah, I thought you were going to say Adney. For some reason, I I don't know. I saw a young Brian Castner in Adney, I think. So.
Yeah, I mean, Tappan Adney's the obvious answer because he's the writer, right? He's the journalist for Harper's Magazine. I mean, Adney's also great because he wrote a very fat book with lots of great descriptions. And so, like, he's a major source of the whole thing.
Yeah.
And yeah, Adney's, and because he's great on the whitewater, he's a canoeist, he's, you know, spends all this time in New Brunswick. I mean, he is really interesting. He's a journalist who, you know, was a naturalist before, killed the moose and stuffed it. That became like the prize moose in the American Museum of Natural History in New York City. Like he's, again, like one of these kind of really interesting, you know, touches lots of key events in world history kind of guys that you've just never heard of.
Yeah, it's interesting.
I mean,
I like the story of Dietz quite a bit. Like, I don't know, but I think I'm not sure I like his character, but I like that story of just the able young rich guy who's super outfitted, you know, and has a whole team just getting cut down by the elements type thing.
Yeah, I mean, that was my Dietz's story, who thought he could organize a mining expedition because he knew how to organize, you know, events at the YMCA, right? Like, I mean, he was my chance to, that chapter was really my chance to write a Krakauer, you know, a Krakauer type story where 19 go in and only 4 come out, right? It is much more like that classic Alfred Lansing, you know, Caroline Alexander, like, you know, wilderness survival story. It's the purest form of it. I wanted to go back to one other thing on Tappan Adney, though. You asked if Disappointment River if that book led to this book. It did in this very important way, in that Tappan Adney was a major source for the Disappointment River book, because after all of his Klondike adventures and everything else, he becomes obsessed with canoe making, and the people in the Maliseet people in New Brunswick, who were connected with the voyagers and all the fur trading and all the other stuff that I had written about. And basically, we know how birch bark canoes were made back during the Voyager time because Tappan Adney saved that knowledge himself. So I first encountered him like as a historical source for that book, and then he ends up being a character in this one. So I guess I am like the shadow Tappan Adney fan. He should be my number one.
Yeah, I should say also that my dad read Disappointment River back when he did that talk in Akron. He loved that one too. So
Well,
you're
good.
you're just walking through the decades writing books for my dad.
It is. I'm checking all the dad boxes, I guess.
Um, all right, so I wanted to ask you about researching the Soapy Smith section of the book, because to me it seemed like, or writing the Soapy Smith section of the book, it seemed like he might be one of those characters who kind of hides from history a bit. So it might be difficult to find information, or was it similar? There was just a lot of stuff out there.
Well, it's similar in that he had a great great grandson who is obsessed with getting all of his great great grandfather's material together. And so had a bunch, not all, but had a lot of material in a self-published book that I was able to corroborate in a lot of newspaper clippings. I mean, that's a case where I think that the only thing I add to the Soapy Smith story, because he became somewhat famous and is like, if you go up to Skagway now, you can go on the Soapy Smith tour, right? Like he's a tourist attraction in some ways. But I think what I add is like an understanding of the moment that we live now and able to tell his story in a, with a more modern eye. Like he was really a master of misinformation and where people, deceiving the public generally. And I mean, he was fake news before fake news, right? Like his whole shtick was fake news. And I think writing about him now, you see kind of the effectiveness of misinformation, disinformation, like how he was able to get a whole town into his clutches, essentially, because people didn't know what to believe. He just, put so much information out there and was such a good con man that he attracted this following in some ways and was able to take over the town. So I think I contribute that. And there's also, I mean, I hide this in the footnotes. There is actually a controversy over who shot Soapy Smith. Again, spoiler, not to give away, that part of the book. But in my day job, I'm a war crimes investigator for Amnesty International. It kind of comes from my military time and my time as a journalist, but also like all my weapons work that I did being a bomb technician in the military. And so as part of my job now, I look at a lot of crime scene photos, crime scene, so to speak, photos, a lot of photos of dead bodies, people who have been shot, trying to, doing some of that very basic pathologist work. And so there are photos of Soapy Smith after he died, and photos of the bullet wounds and everything else. And so I think you can make a compelling case of who actually shot him and with what weapons they were present based upon the size of the bullet wounds.
Who was it?
What was that?
Who was it?
Well, no, I think, well,
oh, you mean the way you portrayed it in the book, you mean?
Yeah, the way I portrayed it in
okay.
the book is the way I think is the most likely way that it happened.
Okay.
I mean, but actually that raises kind of like a writing question. Like there's lots of unsettled parts of history, right? And so when you're writing narrative nonfiction, it really breaks the spell, so to speak, if you then step away and say, well, you know what? A lot of historians disagree and think maybe this might have happened on this day instead of that day or whatever else, right? So what I try to do is, in many cases, tell the story that's kind of what I think is the best, what best fits the facts, but then also be honest. And if there is a disagreement, if historians have good faith arguments on both sides or different interpretations, I write that up in the footnotes and say, hey, there's a lot of dispute about this and here's why, and try to represent that.
Yeah, best not to. I liked how you handled the notes in the book, by pointing out what sentence it was in the note, but not actually including the footnote numbers and the text, not breaking it up that way.
I mean, the book would be covered in numbers if I did that. So I try to avoid
a lot of notes.
Yeah.
Would have interrupted things a bit. So Michael says he was impressed by Ethel Berry, and I was impressed by Brenda Mulrooney, and you mentioned oh, I can't remember. Anna
Anna
Degraff,
Degraff.
is it?
Yeah.
A lot of the women have a bit of grit in the Klondike.
They do. And I guess that's also something that I was able to do writing now. I mean, the last real successful popular history of the Klondike was written by Pierre Burton in 1957 or something, right?
Wow.
Like he told a very different story, where the men were manly and the indigenous people and the women were kind of wallpaper for what the men were doing. It was just written in a very different time. And something I wanted to do was definitely, as much as possible, tell a more complete story, whether it was indigenous voices or the voices of the women. I mean, the Stampede was definitely, demographically, it was 95% men. But having said that, the women that were there, some of them had absolutely extraordinary stories and didn't want that to get lost. And I think looking at, again, looking at this with maybe 2021 eyes, why was Clarenceberry so successful? It's because it wasn't Clarenceberry, it was Ethelberry as well. And they were really like, they were a partnership, husband and wife partnership. And she was the accountant. She was, she was making food for the crews. She was doing all these things that if, many other solo prospectors, they didn't have a partner. They couldn't do all of this. And so she was definitely a full partner in all of that. And yeah, so I tried to write that as much as,
Yeah,
like Michael was saying.
I like when they get off the boat or off the ship in San Francisco and huge media moment, and they're interviewing Clarence, and he gives credit to his wife there. That's pretty progressive for the time, I thought.
Well, and that comes right out of the newspaper. So yeah, it is, but I think it says something about progressive for the time for sure, but also says something about the general truth of it, I think, right? Like it's I think he knew what was up at the time, especially as we learn now, kind of like, and he described all the things that she was doing.
So off the wall question for you, but if Brenda Mulrooney and Soapy Smith ended up in the same town instead of opposite towns, who would end up running it?
I think, unfortunately, I have to give it to Soapy. I think that just because Soapy had a gang that nobody knew was his gang, and he was very willing to pay off all the politicians, pay off the law, et cetera, et cetera. I guess maybe it would also matter what town it was. If they were both in Skagway that had effectively no law enforcement, maybe Soapy. If they were in Dawson City, that it did eventually have a relatively, well, comparatively, I should say, large presence of Northwest Mounted Police, maybe he would have been less successful.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask you. You mentioned a couple of times there your the depiction of Native people in the book, I guess, and I wanted to ask you about the choice to include, I don't know, racial epithets in the book. What thinking went into that, and it seems like you thought about it because you included the author's note about it.
I did. I thought long and hard, and I think this goes to the desire to not glorify or sugarcoat or kind of like paper over the violence. And I think that's, to me, part of that, it's the physical violence, but then also be, really honest about the racial antagonism, the violence against women, and the words that people used. And they're not words that I use, and I won't, use in this event. But I tried to be really careful. I tried to only put the words in people's mouths when it was really them saying it, like not use it gratuitously, pay attention to it. Sometimes, the N word was included in people's names. And so it's a proper name. And if that's their proper name, I used it. But again, I tried not to do it gratuitously. But I think the casualness of the racism, but then also, it had real consequences, like Indigenous people were lynched. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the first people hung officially in Canada, in Dawson City, even, after the mob lynchings, even when it was the law doing it, it was Indigenous people that were being hung, right? So I don't want to shy away from that. I think that's like it's telling a more complete picture, especially because the perceived safety of the Klondike, especially on the Canadian side, if there is, in the Canadian version of a lot of these, like how safe it was is still part of the myth. And the proof of that was that if you were a white, if you were a prospector and you fell asleep at the bar, your gold in your pouch would still be there when you woke up. And they're like, oh, see, it's so safe. Nobody will steal anything else. Well, yes, it's safe for the white male prospectors, and it was pretty violent for lots of other people. And it's just, not that part is just not covered in many of the popular histories.
Yeah, I think using the words is kind of a way to shock people awake a little bit. I had a really interesting conversation about profanity, like a couple of these back. Did a talk with a linguist who had a book about profanity, and he said that his whole thesis in the book was that the only profanity we really have left, or the only words that really have power anymore are the racially charged ones. So it just is interesting.
I do think that's right. And again, like, I don't want to overuse the word. I'm not trying to celebrate it or like something like that, right? Like but I feel like not using the words gives an incorrect impression of how people were actually talking and thinking at the time.
Yeah. All right, we can shift gears away from that one now.
Okay.
So I saw your author photos taken on the Chilkoot, or is that how I say it, Chilkoot Trail?
Yeah. So there's both the Chilkat Mountains and the Chilkoot Trail. So
okay.
Yeah, you have to differentiate them. Chilkoot.
So I wonder, did you hike the whole thing, and did you find it difficult? I don't know.
I found it actually the most pleasant, wonderful backpacking that I've ever done anywhere, and I did it with my wife and two of my sons, and like anyone can do it. It's a national park on both the American and Canadian sides. It starts in Skagway. You need a permit. You have to apply for the permits ahead of time. They only let so many people go. When you go, you have to make a plan about where you're going to camp. The campsites are designated. You have to put your tent on like these platforms that they have, so that way you don't kind of mess anything up. It's more like an open air museum. Like there's still stuff everywhere. There's boots and like the reason I know what boiler was used for steam power like in Canyon City is because the boiler is still sitting there, and it's like you can read it was made in San Francisco in 1890 whatever, right? So it was just wonderful. We had incredible weather. We did it in August. It's 30, so you only do 35 miles, which is from the coast up to Lake Bennett. And then there's a train. Well, it's the White Pass, railroad that comes back to Skagway. And that, it's easy. You do it in like 4 or 5 days, 7 miles a day or so. That's relatively easy. The actual pass itself is really that steep, and a bit harrowing.
It does go through the actual pass in the book? It does.
Yes.
Huh. Wow.
Yeah. So
it's wild. It's wild that it's relatively pleasant and easy, and that many people died on it. Maybe it's global warming. Well, it might be the time of year you went too.
Yeah, I'm doing it in August, and I'm not doing it in the winter.
Yeah.
I'm well fed. I have lots of amazing gear, and I only have to do it once. So this is the thing. Like, I'm not taking 1,000 pounds of equipment.
Yeah.
Like, they had to do it every mile. They did 20 times, right?
Yeah.
To drag all their gear. It's a very different experience to do it with, lightweight modern camping equipment.
Yeah. Interesting. I wanted to ask, is did you go to like Dawson City and stuff like that?
So I didn't go to Dawson City itself. I mean, I read all the archives up there. Why didn't I? Well, COVID is part of the reason. As I was finishing things up, I had to stop traveling. But the other reason is Dawson City does not exist in the book. I mean, as it is in the book. Like there is literally nothing left from the gold rush era, and everything's been built back. And it's a tourist trap. I mean, it's not even really a reflection of itself. And so it was actually a conscious choice at a certain point. I don't read fictionalized versions of historical events when I'm writing about that era, because I don't want to accidentally include a detail that was fictionalized in a nonfiction work. So I'm not interested in knowing what it looks like, on Main Street in Dawson City today, because I don't want to accidentally pick up a detail and use it that's wrong, right? Like the details that I'm interested in come from the photographs of the time.
Yeah, that's too bad. I looked up, I was interested enough that I looked up some of the buildings on Wikipedia and stuff, and I was hoping that like the Fairview Inn or something still was standing, but no such luck. All right, so I want to ask you about your current job as investigating war crimes for Amnesty International. You said, and you have a past as obviously a military career, Iraq War veteran. Do you think? I wondered how your military career informs your writing. Do you think that you're more drawn to the? I mean, at its heart, this book is like action, adventure, pacing, but it's also a huge human tragedy, right? It's also about the dark side of human nature. So do you think that, your background and your current day-to-day makes you drawn to the dark side, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm, if I were to describe my author beat, it does involve these kind of human tragedies. Those are stories that I'm drawn to. And as I was saying before, like just the scale of the tragedy, the fact that people died anonymously has a lot, that is similar in a lot of ways to war. And if not the American experience in Iraq and Afghanistan, there so many civilians have died in those conflicts, and oftentimes really they are anonymous, at least as far as Americans are concerned. I do think that I'm drawn to that. But I'll say this, like writing about 1897 was a break from some of my day job stuff with Amnesty. It was nice to write about a historical thing that did not have it has modern echoes, but it was not I'm not writing about something that happened last year. I'm writing about, it was a good way to separate my brain and try to have another project where I was thinking about something else.
Yeah. So in the books afterward, you call clondicitis an infection, sorry, I'm going to read the quote because I'll mess it up, yes. But an infectious cloudiness of reason run amok. Is that right? I think that's right, but it's pretty nice sentence there.
Well, thank you.
You compare it to the current phenomena of QAnon and stuff like that, and so I'm wondering, is that infectious cloudiness of reason, is that uniquely American, do you think?
I don't know if that part is uniquely American, although I think we are definitely, if not unique, I think we're definitely prone to it throughout history, and having these kind of, let's think about, the people that our ancestors that chose to come here, the non-indigenous people, the non-enslaved people, but the people that chose to come, were predisposed to be the kind of person that would seek opportunity and, sail across an ocean, right? And now many Americans are descendants of those people. And even immigrants coming now, there still are, whether they're coming from India or Africa or wherever they're coming from are still people willing to like make a major change in their life for hopes and dreams, I guess. So I guess it's I'm totally of two minds about this. Like on the one hand, yes, like how could these people have honestly believed that there was $70 million in plain sight, like Easter eggs on the ground, which is how it was described in the newspapers? Like, are you kidding me? Like, how did you, like the stories that came out of the Klondike in the papers were insane. And yet on the other hand, I want to forgive them because it's definitely, I think, not necessarily an American thing, but like really human nature to be willing to take a risk for this possible reward. We see it happening now. It happened then. It happened, like I said, with some of our ancestors from before. I don't know. I don't want to be too hard on them. But when it comes to the mania part of it, like just being willing to drop everything to like believe this. I don't know. I wrote QAnon, but I think it's also, I also said it's like a Ponzi scheme, right? Like it is a pyramid scheme. The people that were there first got rich and everybody else, were left out. And so I think maybe Ponzi scheme is the best analogy, and people still get taken in on those.
Yeah. So I've been doing a few of these talks in a row. And this just happens to be the third one that has to do a lot with money and a lot with poor people, like, right,
Okay.
And a lot with poor people at the bottom, trying to grab onto more type thing, and to dramatic and tragic effect in all three of the books. And so I was talking last week with the novelist Willoughby-Eastlake about this topic. And he said that his book was about greed, but about the idea that greed is good, the American idea that in our culture,
right,
greed is good, great wealth is celebrated, really rich people are celebrities and we think of them ethically as better than us or something. But he was also saying he decided to take that idea and apply it to someone at the very bottom and give them those tools of greed and let them go wild and see what happened. And so I was wondering, I guess, if you thought about the idea of greed, or the idea of greed, is it?
I am not a greed is good. What was the guy's name? Gecko from whatever that movie was, Gordon Gecko. I am not agreed.
There's like a Trump quote that's like pretty parallel to that too.
I am not a greed is good person. I think there's two different things going on. I think there is like there are some people that are so economically desperate that they will do all sorts of things, and that was true here, and it's true today, and it's true with immigrants today that are willing to travel such long distances for an economic opportunity. I think that phenomenon I have trouble calling greed. I think that it's like just wanting more for your children or whatever else. Like I get that. I think that there's though the point where it crosses over and it's more morally ambiguous is that the Stampeders themselves were actually not the poorest of the poor. You needed some money to be able to go. You needed $1,000 to get an outfit together, right? So Jack London was super poor, but he borrowed the money from his sister who mortgaged her house to pay for it. So they needed a little money to do it. And so I think the way I put it in the book was, there were a lot of police officers and streetcar drivers and like somewhat middle class people that went on the Stampede. And the people most affected by the Klondicitis were people who felt like they deserved more. Like they had some, but they deserved better and had just enough resources to be able to make this trip, right? So again, I obviously am of at least two minds about this. I can I can argue both sides of it, like the human nature of doing it, and yet the actual people who did it, a lot of them had at least a little means, and some of them were definitely seeking glory, like, former Civil War generals and like, newspaper reporters and like lots of people that were definitely trying to become famous by going to the Klondike.
Yeah. All right, I want to ask you one more kind of general question about the book, and then a couple questions about books.
Okay.
Work at a library. Got to ask about the books.
Sure.
But so the last general question I want to ask is, I found it interesting, like the kind of labor code that developed among the miners, or I guess it was called the Miners Code in the
That's right.
the Henderson section. But then, of course, they formed tribunals and et cetera. And then, of course, it devolved. Well, I mean, no spoilers, but it devolved at the end of it.
Right.
But so I was interested if you thought at all about if there were lasting effects of the Klondike Gold Rush on working class people or on the labor class.
That's an interesting question, and I'm not sure I'm qualified to answer it necessarily. I think the Miners Code. Well, let me start and see if I can get there. So the Miners Code was, really, I mean, it made economic sense, and it was for everybody's safety up there. Like, the things punishable by death were like stealing food, because if you stole somebody's food, it was as good as killing them. And that's why, stealing somebody's gold was also, considered such an infraction. But also part of the code was if you found something, you told everybody else. And that just makes economic sense. Now, a prospector can't be everywhere in the river at once. And so you lose nothing and you gain everything, because you can only claim 1,000 feet anyway of riverbed. It makes economic sense for everybody to help each other up there, at least in that way. Now, what kind of lasting effect has that had? I don't know. I mean, I guess it strikes me that at least the stereotype is that people in Alaska are still loners who go off on their own cabin and want to be left alone, and not necessarily that kind of everybody helps each other. Having said that, when I paddled the Mackenzie River for Disappointment River for that book, I was helped all along the way by people living in the middle of nowhere. Well, some of them stole from me. I mean, that definitely happened in the book, but then also people who helped out simply because even if you have very little, I don't know, in a rural, like really isolated area, everybody does need to take care of each other on some end. So I don't know, like strains of it maybe. I think that though there's probably a sociological, economic, academic answer to this. I feel like there's a right answer to your question, and I don't know it. And I'm curious if somebody's written it up.
Yeah, I did like an adventure trip when I was in my 20s. I biked, on a bicycle across the U.S. I had the same experience. A lot of just I mean, it was weird because I unintentionally kind of like made myself homeless for 2 months to bike across the country. And
right.
Same experience, just random people, being really generous and helping out, and it really changes your view of I don't know, middle America, I guess, or America in general, when so many people want to be so nice. All right, so on to the book questions.
Okay.
What's the best book about the Klondike Gold Rush you read in researching this book?
I mean, so the classic, which I think is the best, is Pierre Berton's that I've already mentioned. It's got multiple titles, whether it was published in Canada or the U.S. I think Last Great Gold Rush or Klondike is the name of one. I mean, Pierre Berton has such a strong voice. I mean, it's such an engaging style that I read it at the start of my research and then never touched it again, because I was afraid of like like that strong voice being such an influence that I would write up things in his way, and I didn't want to do that. I wanted to write my own story. It's the classic for a reason. Pierre Burton's kind of like Canada's David McCullough, and and I mean has written lots of these kind of takes on Canadian history, and I think does an excellent job.
Yeah, cool. So other recommendations for my dad.
Oh boy. Does your dad only want to read narrative history, or is he willing to
only action-packed narrative history, preferably contemporary?
Wow. Okay. Action-packed narrative. Okay, so I have two answers. The first one is not action-packed, but if he hasn't, I think the best narrative nonfiction book, hands down overall, is John Hershey's Hiroshima. I think all of us are trying to write Hiroshima, which is, Stampede is multiple characters told from their perspective. It's like, I mean, it's the influence that I'm embarrassed to mention. So I think Hiroshima is one answer. For the action-packed one, Candice Millard's River of Doubt, which is Teddy Roosevelt's book. Well, then I don't think I can do better.
It is a great book, though. It's a good one.
Yeah, Teddy Roosevelt in the Amazon. It's like, can't make it up, that he would go down there, and there's a river named after him. One of the tributaries of the Amazon is named for him.
So last question, what's the next book about? What are you working on now?
So I'm in a different place than I used to be. So for the last 10 years, essentially, every time I've been writing a book, I've started the next book before the next one comes out, right? So I both had an answer to this question and kind of a leg up. When we last did an event together for Disappointment River, I was already working on the Klondike. I don't have that now. What I'm trying to do is finally read, because when I'm writing a book like this, I basically only read, things that have to do with the book. There's just so much to read, you can't possibly get through it all. So I'm taking the opportunity to read completely different things and then be open to, I don't know what the next inspiration is going to be, but I'm trying to let myself take a breather for a minute.
It's interesting because I ask everyone that question, and I think people do it both ways. Sometimes they'll start something in between public, getting it finished and it being published, and sometimes they'll wait a little while. But sometimes when they wait a little while, it turns into a little while, though. So.
Well, I don't want it to be a little while, but I do want to give myself an opportunity to write something, if not completely different. I mean, I had a major shift from writing about military stuff into writing more history, but all of it's been narrative. So I think whatever I write, I think the narrative is, the propulsion that you kindly called it. I think that's what I bring to these stories. So that's what I'd be trying to do again.
Yeah, cool. Well, that's what I've got.
Okay.
That went quick. Hour and several minutes. So. And
change. I mean, I'd be happy to answer any questions from anybody around, but if there aren't any, then that's fine too.
Well, so there's one more. It says, where was it? Oh, well, I think it was mentioning when we were talking about the idea of greed and things like that. It was mentioning how that relates to the American dream. And I think it's a good question, because I think this book is about the American dream, but that's also intertwined with greed for sure. I mean,
yeah, and the lengths you'll go for it, right? Yeah, I think, you're going to get me on a soapbox here, and I'll talk for another half hour if I'm not careful. But the fact that the American dream is bound up in a consumer vision of that, our American, at a certain, there's multiple versions of this American dream. Like there's an American, well, okay, I'm going to contradict myself again. So I think when we say the American dream, we often talk about having your own home or starting your own business or being an entrepreneur or whatever else. Like it's a very consumer driven version of that. But we also tell ourselves these American myths about the frontier and about boundless spaces. And like that doesn't have to be a consumer thing necessarily. That can be a bloody past when it comes to like seizing indigenous people's land and that kind of stuff. But it is much more of a natural ideal, I guess. And the Klondike is both. It both is that American myth of the frontier West combined with that consumer American dream. So I think it is definitely both intertwined.
So I just looked at the Facebook. Luckily, I refreshed it because I hadn't refreshed, but there's a couple questions on there also.
Okay, let's do it.
One is, what's your personal opinion of Jack London? Which we may have covered that, but
I mean a little bit. I think I don't know. Like he ends up a rich guy on a yacht who's preaching socialism. Do as I say, not as I do. So like where he ended up, I'm not so sure. But the road he took to get there, and as a Buffalonian, he was jailed in Buffalo for a month, and actually in the Erie County Holding Center, which still has the same reputation for being a terrible place where inmates die all the time, and he had like that hasn't changed much. I guess I'm going to give London the mixed rating, but when it comes to the outdoor stuff, I'm going to give him the thumbs up.
Yeah, it's hard to be too negative when you read something like that in high school and it's formative and it's that good. I mean, so
agree.
So how do you think this is related to the racist terms in the book and stuff? But the question is, what do you think would have changed if you had? How do you think the book would have changed if you had if you had acted as an editor there, or imposed your authorial voice? Or we may have covered that one a little bit too, but
I did. But I guess the last thing I would say about that is something. I think if I had done that, I would have written a different book. Not that it's absolutely fundamental, but something I was trying to do throughout is use the language of the time. And it's not just a racial epithet thing. It's like any of the words, like to keep the book completely within its own box of the time. So like an example of this is what Soapy Smith was doing is called racketeering, but the word racketeering did not exist in 1898. So I don't use it. Right. So like, I mean, that was a choice from the beginning. And I tried to, and if I'm not going to use any of the words, and if I'm going to try to keep it true to itself, I tried to be consistent with that. There is another version of this book, which is written from 2020, right? And that's it doesn't delegitimize it. It would just be a different book.
Yeah, might not be as exciting. I don't know.
I mean, I guess I want to say I'm not using the words to be exciting necessarily. It's just keeping it true to like exactly how racist, exactly how bloody, exactly how violent. That was one of my goals.
Yeah.
And if that makes it not a book, if it makes some people uncomfortable, then I totally get that. It makes me uncomfortable. Yeah. If it makes it so uncomfortable that they don't want to read it, I respect that. But as the writer, like this is what I thought this was the best I could do.
Yeah. So a final comment from Michael, who's been with us the whole time. Thank you, Michael.
Appreciate that.
He says, please let Mr. Castner know that I hope his book will be considered for literary awards. National Book Award, maybe even Pulitzer. So there you go.
Well,
I was thinking big. And
if you've got any poll, Michael, with the various committees, then you're welcome to put in a good word, I guess. But finish it. Maybe, I don't know, if you don't like the ending, you might rescind your recommendation. But no, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Well, Brian, thank you very much for visiting with us tonight. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, always a pleasure. Thank you for the invite. And it was good to see you again. And I hope everybody that tuned in and both, enjoyed the talk and enjoyed the book.